So, with the Labour Party conference in Brighton, I think it's a good time to look a little bit at Keir Starmer's leadership so far, as I see it. Um, I was a big critic of Corbyn because I think his worldviews were incompatible with the leader of the United Kingdom or potential leader of the United Kingdom. I found it rather abhorrent that Corbyn would effectively praise left-wing dictators. I thought it was lamentable that he would appear on Russia Today, that he chaired Stop the War Coalition for years, a very, very dubious organisation, that he pandered to terrorist groups despite he and his supporters claiming otherwise. I think the anti Semitism issue is important, and I think Corbyn failed to take a hold of that, but I don't think it's the only problem with Corbyn and Corbynism. Um, Now, the thing about Corbyn and Corbynism is it did tap into the old left in terms of a lot of traditional left wing um, concerns. So, was it 100% a bad thing? No. But I just think that his worldviews were too toxic to be a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. You cannot aspire to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom if you blame the United Kingdom for every issue. I mean, Corbyn never once, on any major issue, defended this country's national interests. He would always advocate for the other side every time. After Salisbury, I haven't forgotten how he basically told the same narrative as Russia Today. Oh, we don't know Russia was guilty, and this is something I find frankly unforgivable. To tell that same narrative. Anyway, Corbyn is yesterday's man. Yet the strange thing in the Labour Party is his ghost still seems to be here, metaphorically speaking. Um, Keir Starmer, to me, always looks more like a prime minister in waiting, but that doesn't mean he is a prime minister in waiting. And frankly, Corbyn set such a low bar that it wouldn't be difficult to see many MPs as being a more viable occupant of number 10 than him. There's a few things about Starmer that make me uneasy. Now, I haven't watched his full conference speech. I should put that caveat. Um, I will say this: it had optimistic tones. I think it was relatively successful. I wouldn't say that Starmer's, this is the first conference in person. Last year, of course, with the pandemic really in its full peak in this country, everything was socially distanced. So Starmer, like a lot of leaders at various levels around the world, has had to, you know, operate under that context. So this was a big test, and probably it will be seen that Starmer passed it, but not passed it glowingly. I mean, he got resounding applause. The Corbynites were vocal, but in a minority. They were jeering him, but again, they were in a minority. I would say Keir Starmer done relatively well in this conference, from what I've seen. But that isn't enough to do well in your own party conference. It's not enough to convince the rest of the public. Now, me personally, when Starmer became leader, I always give any new leader the benefit of the doubt. I always think, well, give them a chance. Now, I'm not a Labour voter, but I could vote Labour. It's not like I'm so partisan that I would rule not voting for that party, rule out voting for that party, I should say. I think Labour, when it's at its best, can be a force for good. I think that it can be a progressive centre-left force for good. And I'm kind of retrospective Blairite, if I could put it that way. Tony Blair left office in 2005. I was 20 at the time, and that is around the time I started getting political at the time. I was a member of the Liberal Democrats. In fact, I joined that year. So I became political. No, I just made a mistake. Tony Blair didn't leave office in 2005. He left in '07. I should say '05 was his third election victory. But there's sort of an overlap between me getting into party politics and Tony Blair leaving party politics or leaving premiership. And I was very critical of Blair at the time. I was a strong critic of the Iraq War. I still think that was his biggest blunder. But I'm kind of a retrospective Blairite in the sense that I think he was probably the best prime minister in my lifetime, and I'm including Margaret Thatcher in that. I think that Tony Blair had a lot of significant achievements, and unfortunately, Iraq and other areas such as 90 days detention and a lot of serious question marks on domestic policy regarding civil liberties do cloud over his legacy. But I think he's a very, very clever political operator, and in my opinion, he probably is the best prime minister of my lifetime. I think he's a great man. And people can ridicule that, but I believe Tony Blair is a great man. Now, in terms of Keir Starmer, clearly he's not Tony Blair, but he's also a bit of an enigma. What is Keir Starmer? Um, I think part of the problem is in delivery, he is still more like a lawyer or a barrister than a politician. I think to be an effective politician, you have to be populist to some extent. And I made that video recently about populism where I said that I think sometimes it can be utilized in a good way. I think Starmer has still not entirely done that. He's quite academic. He's clearly smart. He's clearly an intelligent man, but don't know if he fully operates as a politician. I think he still, he was a director of public prosecutions, and he still comes across as a barrister. A bit dull, a bit academic, and that unfortunately is not a vote winner. Maybe that's shallow. Maybe people shouldn't look at that. But it's when you contrast that with someone like Boris Johnson, despite all the blunders and gaffes that Johnson has made, despite stubbornly defending, you know, cabinet ministers that have done things that they really should have been sacked for earlier, despite his own personal gaffes, Johnson remains reasonably popular. I mean, it's uncanny for a prime minister over 2 years into his term to remain personally quite popular. Most prime ministers have a honeymoon period of roughly 6 months. Gordon Brown had it, Theresa May had it, um, and then there's some big crisis and their popularity goes down. In the case of Boris Johnson, he's survived coronavirus, he's survived the fuel crisis, Brexit, um, and it looks like whilst there is perhaps growing dissent, I don't think Boris Johnson's job is in serious question internally in his party. Whereas Keir Starmer, it's not a good sign when you already have leadership speculation and he's not even in the job for 2 years. So there's no mystery that Angela Rayner is looking at the leadership. Um, Andy Burnham's a lot more subtle about it. Wes Streeting has been named. Lisa Nandy has been named. That cannot be very encouraging for Keir Starmer to see that sort of, talk. So maybe he does need to be a lot more radical in the sense that maybe he needs to do a Kinnock. Maybe he needs to really get quite ruthless and expel the hard left in the way that Kinnock did. Um, it would be risky. Of course, it would be risky. It's politics. But the problem is that you get someone like Angela Rayner who's very outspoken, and I personally think she would be a very divisive and polarizing figure in the country, be popular with grassroots Labour, but I think she would not win an election. I think she'd be a polarizing figure. The problem is Starmer is kind of being upstaged by her. That's not a good sign. Where you have this kind of moderate leader who's quite dull, he's not overly inspiring, he's capable, but he's not overly inspiring, and he's being overshadowed by his outspoken deputy. That's not a good situation. Um, but personally, I call Starmer moderate, but I think in some areas he is doing a bit of a Joe Biden in the sense that he's pandering to the woke left of his party. So, an example of this, I'm just going to quote this from the Times. This is by Eleni Kuria. Hope I'm pronouncing, I assume that's a woman, her name correctly. In fact, the report is precisely about that. Um, Sajid Javid has accused Sir Keir Starmer of a total denial of scientific fact after the Labour leader entered the debate over transgender rights. This has become a real battlefield within the Labour Party. Rose Duffield, the Labour MP, has said that she won't go to conference because she's frightened for her safety. Now, this is relating to? Let me just get the quote. It's get the right part of the article. Um, Yeah, so yes, asked on the Andrew Marr show on BBC One Whether it was transphobic to say that only women have a cervix, Starmer replied, it's something that shouldn't be said. It's not right. Javid responded on Twitter that Starmer's words were total denial of scientific fact, he added, and he wants to run the NHS. Um, Speaking to the BBC yesterday, Starmer said there needed to be a mature, respectful debate about trans rights. Well, mature and respectful, well, what about honest? I mean, reprimanding a female MP for saying that it's transphobic to say that women have a cervix. This is lunacy, absolute lunacy. This female MP wasn't saying that trans people don't have rights. I mean, this is the crazy thing about the trans debate. We're now in a situation where women are being shamed and denounced for simply stating biological fact. It's like these debates over breastfeeding humans, women, right? Um, So I think that shows weakness on Starmer's part. It's all very well wanting to be respectful and sensitive to trans people. That's fine. But Starmer has to be consistent and show that he also cares about women's rights. And the problem with this debate is um, I'm just going to quote Rose Stuffield here. It was disappointing that the discussion was framed solely around trans rights rather than women's rights, which is what concerns me most about this issue. Women now need to hear clearly from Keir Starmer that the Labour Party will listen to and respond to our concerns about upholding and protecting single sex services outlined in the 2010 Equality Act. Starmer insisted that Duffield was welcome at the conference. I spoke to Rosie earlier this week and told her conference is a safe place for her to come. Well, can he guarantee that? Can he guarantee that? I don't know if she's followed up on that, if she has stayed away or what. But it is true that there has been trans activists making threats against women, not just within the Labour Party. Look at what happened to J.K. Rowling. She was lambasted with vitriolic comments from trans activists and their allies uh, over a book that she'd written, a novel that she'd written, which was supposedly transphobic, and it really wasn't. So that's one area, and I know I've mentioned this before, but I think it's important. When that teacher was hounded out of his job, basically forced into hiding because he was giving a lesson on blasphemy in Batley, West Yorkshire, earlier this year, there was a deafening silence from Keir Starmer. Now, to be fair, Johnson was also silent. Why is it these two leaders were silent on an important issue when a teacher in Britain is basically facing threats from religious extremists? That is absolutely unacceptable. Keir Starmer needed to speak out on that. Boris Johnson needed to speak out on that. Gavin Williamson, to his credit, did. Um, but it's an absolute disgrace, and there were some Labour MPs, to their credit, who did. But Keir Starmer was silent. My biggest issue with Starmer is that he is politically correct. I think he still is afraid of offending people, and maybe this is his lawyer side coming through. But frankly, I want to see a leader who's more bold, a bit like Blair. Um, I mean, it's interesting. Often the rise of political correctness in British life is associated with Blairism, but actually Tony Blair is quite politically incorrect. I don't mean that he's a demagogue, but looking at Blair's interviews and statements in recent years, he actually talks with a great deal of common sense. And the problem with Tony Blair is people, because he's a polarizing figure, because he's a controversial figure, people don't listen to him. They just think, oh, Tony Blair, warmonger, won't listen. And I think that's unfortunate because, in my opinion, Tony Blair talks a great deal of sense. And he's a free term prime minister. So, of course, he's worth listening to. But he is a former prime minister, so Labour needs to look to the future. I'm going to sum this up, but I think that Labour is a difficult party to run. To be fair, I think whoever is leader will find it a real challenge because it's a big party. It's one of the biggest parties in Europe by membership, and you're trying to balance out, a level-headed centrist approach in order to appeal to the wider public. But then you also, it would be wrong for me as a centrist to say that is necessarily the whole demographic of the UK because I know it's not. There is those who, Brexiteer Labour voters who will have strong views on issues like immigration and so on. It doesn't make them bad people. They've got legitimate concerns. Starmer also needs to consider that if he wants to rebuild this red wall. Um, but then there is the left of the party, which you can't totally ignore either. So really, for any Labour leader, it would be a balancing act. But I think if he does something bold, it will make him despised among Corbynites, right? Let them form a new party, let them form the Socialist Workers' Party revamped or whatever they want to do. But under Tony Blair, Labour was a party that won elections. That's undeniable. And therefore, I think it's practical. I'm not saying Starmer should become Blair Mark II. I'm not saying he needs to go that much to the centre or even, dare I say it, to the right. I mean, one of the things I didn't like about Tony Blair and his New Labour movement was its pandering to the Murdoch press and to the right wing tabloids for too long. I think they were cosy with those rags for too long. So I don't think Starmer should do that. In fact, I would have no problem with Labour standing up for traditional Labour values, things like workers' rights and pushing the minimum wage. I'm okay with that. I think those are good Labour principles. That's what you expect a Social Democratic Party to do. And we need that in British politics. I mean, there's things in the DWP, sanction culture. I wouldn't mind the left of the party having a voice in condemning that sort of situation. Um, and Starmer needs to, stand up for those social democratic principles. But from what I saw at his conference speech, he said everyone in here is a patriot. The very fact that he's willing to use the word patriot, that would have been unheard of in the Corbyn era. So it's not all bad. But I still am not overly excited about Starmer. I guess the real test will be over time. But there are things, if I could ask Mr. Starmer one question, I would say, why did you not speak out on those Islamists threatening the teacher in Batley? Was it because you were frightened of, or you were hesitant to touch on a taboo subject? A leader needs to show backbone, and the leader needs to be prepared to talk about controversial subjects like that. And I feel that Starmer is too cautious too much. He's just wants to keep everyone happy in it. Unfortunately, that isn't politics. Um, I don't know if any of the others would be any better. I mean, would Andy Burnham have spoken up on the Batley School issue? Would Lisa Nandy? Nandy's views on the trans issue are just like Starmer's, so I'm not overly inspired by her either. And incidentally, on the trans issue, I'm all for respecting them as human beings, but to go to the point of smearing women as transphobes simply because they're stating a biological fact is absurd. Um, and I've no vested interest in defending Labour feminists. I disagree with them on a lot of areas, but simply defining what womanhood is, I think that's just to say that's transphobic. I don't see why there can't be a case of respecting trans people, respecting their human rights, respecting them as people, but not bullying women simply for insisting that terminology matters. I think Starmer has failed in that sense. I mean, it's only one issue. There's many, many, many other issues. Um, I think an investigation into COVID, which Starmer's pushed for, conservatives say it's political, but this has been an exceptionally big event in the world and in this country. I think we do need to learn lessons about the future. This country's had a very high death rate. What Starmer has called for and what Labour has called for is an independent inquiry. I don't see what's wrong with that. I think that's reasonable. Another thing I think that Labour can push a bit more on, and they've sort of touched on this, is this idea of a 1945 moment. But they need to galvanise on that. I think like the idea is good, but it's kind of got lost in other headlines. I think Starmer can really, really push that, and who knows, he might be another Clement Attlee. Unlikely, but I wouldn't totally rule Starmer out. As it stands, his leadership is far from glowing inspiration, but I'm prepared to give him more of a chance. I mean, in terms of the next general election, if Starmer really shows that he is prepared to be on the side of common sense, if he is prepared to have a slightly populist streak, um, but not to the point of being detrimental. To be a bit more outspoken. If he could do all these things, I would be tempted to vote Labour in the next election because I'm not a natural Tory. There's a lot of things about the Tories I don't like. Another thing I would like Starmer to do is be a lot more outspoken on China. Under his leadership, it's been okay, but he could be showing leadership there because this is a critical issue. He could be picking up on Johnson's weaknesses. Johnson is quite weak on China. I mean, he flip flops. One day he'll be talking tough, the next day he'll be calling himself a Sinophile. I think Johnson flip flops too much on China. If Starmer can show himself to be tough on China, to be outspoken on issues like human rights, then he will definitely, that's something that would definitely resonate with me. And also to not be afraid to talk about Chinese infiltration in our universities, in our technology sector, and a lot of other areas. If Starmer can do that, that to me would be a vote winner because it's going to be one of the major issues of the 21st century. A rising China, that is a major issue. So Starmer can show strength on that. To me, that's a vote winner. Same with Russia. And I will wrap this up.